Hey everyone, and welcome back. In this section, we'll take our cleaned HR data from last time and use Pandas, Matplotlib, and Seaborn to analyze and visualize this data. I've broken this section down into two main parts. In the first part, which will be this lecture, we'll recreate the pivot tables and charts that we made in Excel. And then in the next lecture, we'll have a look at a few different examples and visualizations too. Let's move on over into our Jupyter Notebook and get started. Okay, so here I am inside of Jupyter Notebook. As we've already looked at basically all of the code for these questions, and the majority of the work will just be in typing it out, for this first lecture, we'll actually work through the existing notebook file instead. You can find this notebook within the section folder along with the cleaned data file as well. And the notebook we're using is just called 01 Exploratory Data Analysis. And like usual, at the top here, I've just gone ahead and imported our libraries and our cleaned HR data. As I mentioned at the start of this lecture, in this one, we're going to go through and recreate the pivot tables and charts that we made in Excel. And then we'll go through some other Python specific examples in the next lecture, such as heat maps. Starting out with our first chart, we've got a pie chart which shows the gender distribution of the employees in our dataset. To create this plot, we've got three different lines of code. Firstly, we create a variable called gender counts, which just counts up all of the different occurrences of each unique value in the gender column of our dataset. So if we take a look at this variable, we'll see that there's 882 males and 588 females in this dataset. We then create a pie chart with the plt.pie function from Matplotlib, which takes in two main arguments, the x argument, which are the values that we actually want to plot. So in this case, I've set this to be our gender counts variable that we made here. And then we've got the labels, which is again just the gender counts variable, but only the index, which we can see from the output of this here is just the row label. And finally, I format the values as a percentage using the auto PCT or auto percent string that we went over before. And finally, I also just added in a title for our chart too. Okay, next up, we had our second chart, which was on the attrition by marital status. For this one, we created both a pivot table and a chart, just like we did in Excel. Starting out with the pivot table, we create a variable, which I've actually just called pivot table, and then to this, we assign Pandas pivot table function. This function takes in a bunch of different arguments, but the main ones that we'll be using here are the data, index, columns, values, and the aggregate function. For this pivot table, we had our data as our df data frame that we loaded in earlier. Our next argument is the index, and this argument just sets the rows that the pivot table will use. So specifying a column here is basically exactly the same as dragging a column into the rows area on our pivot table fields pane. In this case, we'll get our rows for the different categories in our attrition column, which were no and yes. The columns are how we separate our data, similar to dragging data into the columns area of our pivot table in Excel, or adding in a hue argument to our charts as another example, Here, I set our column to be the marital status, so this will just add in different columns for each of these categories, which were divorced, married, and single. The values are the actual data points or numbers that we want to aggregate or put into our pivot table, which for this pivot table was the employee number. And finally, the agfunc is just the aggregation function that we'll use to summarize our values. So here, I've set this to be count, which will just count the number of occurrences for each employee number, but then break this down by the index and then the columns that we set, and then setting it to use the count. Below this, we create a simple count plot to visualize it, with our data as the same df data frame, the marital status on the x-axis, and finally, a hue of attrition. And this will then create separate columns for each of the categories in that column. Then we had chart 3, which was on the revenue and salary by education level. This pivot table had the education column in our rows, with the values used as the employee salary and employee revenue columns. I set the agfunc or aggregate function to be mean, but you might have remembered that by default, agfunc does actually use the mean, so we wouldn't actually have needed to set this. And below this, we have our result, which again is exactly the same as the pivot table that we made in Excel, all the way back in section 8. And then for the chart, we had a column chart, but note here that I didn't actually use Matplotlib or Seaborn to create this plot. Instead, I just called the plot method directly on our pivot table. The kind argument lets us choose what type of plot we want to create, and there's quite a few different options for this parameter, which you can see all of them here. But to create a column chart, we could just use a kind of bar, which I've set here. These next few lines just set and customize our title and axis labels. Chart 4 was very similar with our pivot table and chart respectively. For the pivot table, I added in an additional argument of fill value and set this to be equal to 0, which just fills any missing value with 0. Without this argument, then the value would be NaN, or not a number. Because of the aggregate function, or agfunc, that we set, then we know that if there aren't any values, then it's because that category didn't have any employees in that group. And like before, I then just call the plot method directly on our pivot table using Pandas. Finally, we've got chart 5, which is also pretty similar to the rest of these examples that we've got here. But this repetition here should hopefully really make the process stick with you, so that you can remember how to do it in the future. We've got our pivot table with the index or rows set to be the job role, and then for the values, we've got both the employee salary and employee revenue. So I just pass these in as a list, and then for the agfunc, we use the mean, which again would be optional as this is the default value for this argument. I then recreated the same line plot that we made in Excel in pretty much the same way as our last plots, but setting the kind to be line and then the marker to be O. Okay, and with that, we've now recreated the same pivot tables, charts, and analyses that we made in Excel, but this time in Python by using Pandas, Matplotlib, and Seaborn. I know that this might not have been the most exciting or interesting lecture, as we've just gone over the same analysis steps and topics that we did in Excel, but it's important that you can see how we would recreate what we did in Excel, but in Python. Mainly, just so that you can see how the skills that we learn in one can transfer over to the other, as well as hopefully making the code in Python a little easier to understand, as you've got a reference from what we did in Excel. In the next lecture, we'll have a look at how we could create some different visualizations, such as heat maps, to show the correlations between our different variables, as well as exploring and answering a few other questions. Thanks everyone, and I'll see you there.